Hello, my name's Gavin. This is Genre Books. This is just past the midpoint of October, and I've nearly completed my Victober bingo card. Just one more square to go. The book I'm reading at the moment, should I finish it in time, will allow me to complete the whole set. But I haven't just been focusing on Victober stuff. I'm also a co-host of the fantastic Occult Detective October. So what I want to do today is just give a quick recap of the occult detective things I've been reading in the pre-1960s section. And these might not be the most inspired choices for Occult Detective October, but as a relative newbie to this whole side of things, I wanted to get a number of these more famous foundational figures and some famous texts under my belt before I delve too deeply elsewhere. So, many of these names will be familiar. Some of them also counted as Victober entrants, so I was able to punch my card twice. The first one I think does count. So Fitz James O'Brien, he ended up writing in America, but he was born in Cork and then moved to Limerick and stayed there till his teenage years. So at one point he was Victorian. He wasn't by the time this story came out, but I'm going to take it. So when was this? 1859. What Was It? By Fitz James O'Brien. This is a ghost story that probably reminded me most of the Horror from Guy de Maupassant. It's a little more visceral than this. It's a little more in your face, but I definitely got that sort of vibe from it. Obviously, we don't have a true occult detective by 1859, but this character, Harry, who seems to be a stand-in for the author, comes quite close. I say he's a stand-in from the author because he seems to share some characteristics with him, and was a writer and mentions a story that Fitz James O'Brien had written some years before. Another ghost story, not like this one. This is pretty gothic, as you might imagine from something from the late 1850s. It's set in New York. It is peopled by characters who come across as quite bohemian. They want to investigate this haunted house, but there is no real program of investigation. They're just going to sit back and see what happens. Helped along by two of them, Harry and another character, deciding to smoke some opium to get the juices flowing. I'm not sure that has a bearing on what happens next, but it certainly has a bearing on their reaction to it. So, going to bed one night, he feels a weight on his chest, realizes it is some malevolent entity, begins to wrestle it. Everyone else can't see anything, but when they come up close, they realise that there is actually something there. This entity is invisible. Although this is 150 years old, I don't want to spoil it because it's a fairly short story and you can read it in one sitting, so you might want to. But the investigation as a detection sort of fails. They come into contact with this entity, but are unable to progress. I think it does stop them smoking opium for a while, however. I don't know whether to be considered true occult detective fiction you have to have a resolution. I don't think you have to have as much of a resolution as if this was a pure detective novel. But this one seems quite loose-ended, and quite a somber ending as well. It's a failure on all fronts except as a work of literature, because I really enjoyed it. From the same year, but back across the channel in Old Blighty, 1859, Edward Bulwer-Lytton, The Haunted and the Haunters. Again, a very similar premise, taking possession of a haunted house in order to try to understand what is going on behind the haunting. So, a definition, if not the definition, of occult detective. This character certainly has a passion for finding things out, and puts a premium on his own courage, which is sorely tested. He almost wants to perform a kind of exorcism, although he is not spiritually credentialed in order to do this. Rather, I'm not entirely sure what his plan was, but he takes a revolver with him, which doesn't do much good. He also takes his manservant, as any good Victorian gentleman would do, and a dog. He's the only one who's still there by the morning. So he does survive the night of haunting and pretty sort of visceral terror. And he also does find out the root of the issue. This story was first printed in Blackwood magazine, so 1859. By this point, he had long since been cut off, Bulwer-Lytton, by his family. He had been, his allowance had been stopped. I'm not sure he'd been disinherited, but his allowance had been stopped. But that notion of inheritance recurs in this story. The whole haunting is because of terrible events that have occurred following spoiled inheritances. And without giving anything away, the solution to all this is finally found in a safe. Somewhere where you would expect to find something valuable. I did really enjoy this story. You knew by the bluster and the bravado with which our character goes into this house that he's going to be somewhat undone, and he comes very close to absolutely just running, screaming in terror. I think at some point it's only a door which is unaccountably locked is what prevents him from leaving. But in a way that does force him to have to take a stand, which he does. It's quite a different style to the Fitz James O'Brien, despite the fact that there are certain similarities between some of the characters, despite the fact they come from exactly the same year. But for the next story, we skip forward quite a bit for something altogether more more traditional on both the ghost story front and a beginning of a little bit more traditional on the occult detective front. It's Sheridan the Fanu's Green Tea. Our occult detective comes from a medical background here. Dr. Hyselius is, he's a consulting physician, but he takes on his medical cases as if he were taking on detective cases. There are, unsurprisingly, a number of occult detectives who are also physicians, academics. Back in the time this was written, there isn't really the language to talk about psychiatry, but that is obviously there. But what we have in Green Tea is another failure. Dr. Hyselius would not agree that it is a failure because his get-out clause is that he never really took this case on. He came very close to the solution, but more interesting than the detective is the victim of this continual haunting. This poor man, who I think he's a man of the cloth, but he is being followed, trailed, shadowed. I think shadowed is probably the word, by this apparition, which can't really take any direct action against him, but is invading at some points his every waking moment. It is a creature which is malevolent. It is a creature which is using the power of suggestion to make people do harm. The key to this, the solution to this mystery, why this has happened, is odd. It's certainly something which wouldn't fly today. I'm not entirely sure it flew when this story was first printed, but I don't think it's not about how this shadowy reflection has manifested itself. It is actually about the interpretation of what this manifestation is. And there is, the very strong implication that this is a dark reflection of the haunted man himself. Some people, including in the story, a doctor from the prestigious Harley Street, has basically said, this is all in your own mind. And that is sort of half true, but there is obviously more to it than that. So this story is from 1872. So we're skipping along a little bit from the Fitz James O'Brien and the Bulwer-Lytton. The language is much more suggestive. It's not quite as visceral. We don't have the struggle with the haunting entity nearly as much as had been seen in the previous two stories. What we do have in Green Tea is an appearance of a returning character, someone who will be turning up in stories again and again, which we don't have in those first two stories. We do have for the remainder. Starting with Algernon Blackwood's John Silence, physician extraordinary. So I've taken the very first John Silence story, A Psychical Invasion. This is now skipping forward to 1908, but harkening back to 1859, because we still have a situation where the manifestation has occurred or been accelerated or accentuated by the ingestion of drugs. We've taken a bit of a step down from opium. This is just hashish being used, but this drug being used is actually a step up from the green tea of the other story, but this depends on whether you want to call green tea a drug, which is rather debatable. However, the use of hashish here is used by a writer of humorous short stories in order to increase or accentuate his sense of humour. Shortly after ingesting the drug, it has the opposite effect. There is initial hilarity followed by a connection with this malevolent entity. I think the entity is a she, and I'll say she. I might use it. She drains him of not only sort of he cannot write anything humorous anymore, but which destroys his livelihood, but actually influences what he does write, which becomes very different indeed from his humorous stories. They become detached, grotesque pieces. His stenographer leaves him, and you know that's serious. This is an extreme case of writer's block, and therefore John Silence has been sent for. Now, John Silence is quite a character. He's a medical doctor, but with a very big interest in the occult, and he has trained himself in the occult. He's independently wealthy, so he doesn't need to do any of this, and therefore takes cases which otherwise would not be seen. He has a very distinctive modus operandi, and it involves him moving into the house, getting the victim away from the house, because he thinks that the entity is tethered to the property. And I don't think he's armed. I can't remember. He may have a gun on him, but not only has he bought a dog, he's bought a cat as well, who end up with quite different reactions to the night's events. This story is much more overtly talking about the occult, and Silence in the story mentions higher magic. This is not a throwaway phrase for someone like Algernon Blackwood. He was, I'm not sure at this time, it may well have been, he was a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, a group of people I absolutely one day will be making a number of videos about, because it just looks like a crazy group of guys and girls. But we have with this story a move to more of a detective footing for these occult detective cases, and a suggestion, I won't say amanuensis, but a colleague of Silence is helping bring these stories out in a very pseudo-Holmesian way. It is again, with the next story, a recounting of the tale, possibly in a more social setting, which is the framing device for the next story, which is another classic occult detective, Carnacki, the Ghost Finder, by William Hope Hodgson. The person writing this down is Carnacki's friend Dodgson, so I think we can figure out who that might be based on. Again, this is another first experience of a classic occult detective, and this one really is a bit of a roller coaster, despite the action being confined to one house and then to one room. But this is much more overt in the use of the occult, not just an experience of the occult, but using the tools of the occult in order to sort of defend himself, as well as investigate. So this is entirely malevolent, the entity Carnacki is coming against, and it is a proper battle. I do like the way that Hodgson had Carnacki take old occult symbols and defences and modernise them. Obviously modernising it for a 1910 audience, so still somewhat quaint to us, but at the time, using sort of rather cutting edge technology in a ghost hunting scenario. I am obviously taking a whistle-stop tour through Occult Detective classics here. I am absolutely, once this event is past, coming back to John Silence, coming back to Carnacki to get these books, these collections of stories finished. This is very much just the springboard for me, sort of continuing my reading in this area. But we move into the proper pulp era after this, and the domain of weird tales, with yet another classic occult detective, Seabury Quinn's Jules de Grandin, and the story is 1937's Pledged to the Dead. This takes the Holmesian half vibe from something like John Silence and really puts more of a Holmesian stamp on things. We have absolutely here the Holmes Watson relationship between the Grandin and Dr. Trowbridge, and our main character here seems as self-assured in his domain as Holmes is in his. I think for excitement, this story and the Carnacki that came before it have been the pick of the bunch in the reading this month. There is spookiness in all of these stories. There seems to be sort of genuine terror and a nearness of peril in these stories. Obviously now we're in the pulp era. Now we're in a slightly more permissive time in the late 30s. We have a little bit more sexiness injected into the proceedings. Things that could be hinted at are now spoken about. This man has, the victim we're talking about, has put aside his long-time partner and intended bride because he's gone down to New Orleans and got himself into a spot of bother with a woman who turns out to be long dead. This woman is not so much the problem. Her guardian absolutely is. He feels he's got a death mark on him now, and he may well have a point. So in steps Jules de Grandin to see what he can do to help. Again, I can't say any more without spoiling what is a very fun story, and I'm definitely going to read as many more of his tales I can do. I'd read Seabury Quinn before, but just not one of these. And finally, for the pre-1960s, we skip forward just a year to 1938. We stay within the confines of the pages of Weird Tales, and the first Judge Pursuivant story from Manly Wade Wellman, here writing under the name Gans T. Field. Please don't ask me why. Judge Pursuivant is a bit more of a liminal character in this story than the other detectives have been in theirs. In fact, this is our first experience with the judge, we're not quite sure whether he might not be orchestrating things. But we take this story from the perspective of a skeptic, a former magician who has gone on the lecture circuit debunking spiritualists, mediums, etc. On this lecture circuit, he's often countered by another person doing the same thing, but a proponent, a believer. And between engagements, where they will air their disagreements in public, he whisks him off to see a medium who lives nearby to prove, out of the public limelight, once and for all, this really does happen. There is a supernatural side to life, and it's proved, but at some expense. Considering that this all takes place a couple of hours from a major metropolitan area, this story has a real feel of folk horror about it. There is an area in this town that they go to, this village that they go to, that you do not enter, because that is the devil's domain. The people of the town are liable to grab their torches and their pitchforks. This had certain feelings, gave me certain feelings that of the Wicker Man, apart from anything else. But the judge seems to be the only person who can see clearly through these things, and whilst he is absolutely a believer in the supernatural, seems to take this kind of thing in his stride. And given that he's not a detective or an investigator, takes to it like a duck to water. Anyway, I mean, it's a pulp story, but there is murder, there is romance, there is a werewolf. What more could you possibly want? And what a great introduction to sort of the whole occult detective world. All these long short stories and novellas are. It all fell apart when I tried to read something from the post-1960s. So I'll mention it briefly. I also read in this past week Witches of Scotland, Volume 1 of the Edinburgh Files. And I think all I'll say about that is that is also a book I have read this October. Until next time.